Our gospel lesson this morning comes from the middle of the 6th chapter of St John's Gospel. This is a chapter in which John gathers together sayings and teachings attributed to Jesus around the idea of bread. The chapter begins with John's retelling of the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and this sets the theme for the whole chapter. The start, therefore, is about Jesus' great generosity. The bread and also the fish in that well-known story are a metaphor for his teaching. As bread sustains life, so Jesus' teaching gives and sustains life. And we see at the beginning of the chapter, in the story of the thousands of people being fed, that bread, the bread of life, Christ's teaching, is offered to all. As the chapter progresses, John tells of people being eager to hear about Jesus at first, but increasingly turning against him. And we'll hear little bits of that in the lesson this morning. I think what he's doing is telling us something about initial curiosity and enthusiasm on encountering faith. But for many people, these things wane. Of the thousands who were with Jesus at the beginning of the chapter, only 12 remain with him at the end. And even one of them, John notes, is to turn out to be an enemy. John perceived and wrote about a pattern which persists in the church to this day, that there will be times of great enthusiasm for the faith in people's lives, but only a few will actually remain committed for the long run. The passage which we will hear now, in conjunction with a story about Elijah in fear and discouragement receiving food as a sign of the call to continued commitment, speaks of the bread of life, which is Jesus, his example and his teaching, which, if we make him part of us, will sustain our lives. There are passages such as the one that we have read this morning, which might lead you to conclude that John, as we call the writer of the fourth gospel, was not a great storyteller. Reading this passage as a story, I find it just doesn't work. But rather than criticize John, perhaps I need to examine my own assumptions. If I am assuming that this is a story, am I reading it correctly? Why do I say it doesn't work as a story? I think it is clearly a collection of sayings on the theme, on the subject of bread and eating and nourishment. Sayings strung together and placed within a very loose narrative structure. In many ways, the narrative is pretty inconsequential, but the sayings are strong. Therefore, I think we can safely conclude that these are the valuable elements of this passage. On closer examination, we can see that the ideas of bread and eating and nourishment are all metaphors, ways of using language to speak about something else, something other than what the words themselves would initially imply. Clearly, Jesus would not have claimed literally to be made of flour and yeast and baked in an oven. He's not actual bread. And the eating spoken of in the last verse is not actual eating, not even the sacrament of Holy Communion, though clearly there are resonances of that. The eating is a metaphor for participation in the life of Christ. But why use metaphors in this way? Why not just speak plainly? Why does John not just tell a straightforward story? Arguably, and I find myself increasingly persuaded by this argument, all religious language is metaphorical. And it has to be, because it is trying to express ideas which are otherwise inexpressible. More specifically, this passage, along with the whole gospel, is a kind of meditation on the meaning of Jesus, a meditation arising from and created within a community of Jesus followers, living and worshipping some 70 to 80 years after Jesus' death. None of these people probably had first-hand knowledge of Jesus' life, but they would all have had a sense that his memory, his example, his teaching, and somehow his presence was important in their lives. So the Gospel of John is an insight into who Jesus was for a particular group of people living some 1900 years ago. And I think that the question that this insight should be encouraging us to ask is, who is Jesus for us? What does he mean to us 1900 years later? Will we reach the same answers as the community John wrote for? Maybe, maybe not. And why would we expect to answer this question in the same way as people living all that time ago? The times that we live in are almost unimaginably different from the times those early Christians lived in. Just think how different the world is today from how it was even in the various times of our childhoods. Do we think the same way as we did when we were children? Do we have the same expectations and assumptions? Of course not. And St. Paul very famously said that when he'd grown up, he put away childish ways of thinking. It's the way that we develop. So how could we pretend that faith alone will remain unchanging and unchangeable? Only if we separate it entirely from every other aspect of our lives. And we know that that is neither possible nor desirable, nor, I would suggest, even faithful. Faith cannot, it must not, be separated from the rest of our life. One phrase takes us immediately into the question, who is Jesus for us? What does he mean to us? It's the question which John puts into the mouths of the people. He calls them the Jews. But we should be very careful around language like this because of its obvious anti-Semitic overtones. The language of the fourth gospel has been used to support anti-Semitism, and we must not repeat that grievous wrong either in thought or in speech or in action. But this language is reflective of the fact that tensions were rising within Judaism by the time John was writing. Tensions between those who accepted Jesus as the Messiah and those who did not. I'm not convinced that Jesus himself, so far as we can tell from the Gospels, ever thought of himself as the Son of God or the Messiah. Rather, this was an understanding of him reached by post-Easter people. Remember, all the Gospels were created many years after Jesus' death by people who had become convinced that he was both the Messiah and the Son of God. Furthermore, I'm not convinced that it was Jesus' intention to found a new religion, yet that is what happened. And this use of the word Jews to mean those who did not accept Jesus as Messiah by those who did accept indicates something of a divergence taking place. Judaism splitting and Christianity as a separate religion emerging. So how people were thinking about Jesus then was becoming disruptive. And John expresses that in the question of the people he calls the Jews. He says they were saying, "Is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know?" In other words, some people in John's time were saying that all this Messiah stuff was nonsense. A Nazarene carpenter couldn't possibly be the Messiah. Others, though, were claiming this and more about Jesus, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, that he was himself divine. And we, the Christian Church, are the inheritors of that latter tradition. But that doesn't mean that we cannot and should not be asking that question, who is Jesus for us? Is the concept of Messiah developed by the Jewish people in exile in Babylon relevant for people in Dalkeith so many centuries later? What I'm saying is that these questions have no easy answers. No answer about who Jesus was or is can be fully definitive. There wasn't an easy, incontrovertible answer in John's time, hence the arguments that were taking place within his community. And I'd suggest there isn't one now either, because people have so many different opinions, sincerely held. People within the church and people out with the church. If we really engage with the question of the identity of Jesus, we will find it disruptive of what we may think we know. It forces us to make choices about who we are, about what we do. It is our answer to the question of who Jesus is for us that defines our life of faith. And for those of us who claim that Jesus is important in whatever way, the life of faith should define the whole of life. Not that it can or should be expected to define permanently. All of us change and grow as we get older. Our priorities in life change. Our understanding of what is important to us changes. As we learn, we think differently. And I believe the same should be true with faith. It should change and develop. To be honest, I think there has been too much made of the so-called virtues of a childlike faith, meaning something simple. I'm more interested in a dynamic faith, a faith which asks the hard questions and which changes over time. To me, a faith which is rigid and unchanging, which is too scared to ask questions, risks being a dead faith. What I hope for is a faith about life. And I find pointers to that in these sayings of Jesus collected by John in this chapter. Take the central metaphor of bread. It is basic, probably within the context of first century Palestine, the most basic foodstuff. It is the stuff of life. So this saying of Jesus, remembered or created within John's community, I am the bread of life, speaks of something both basic and essential. Is Jesus the basis of our lives? Do we find Jesus essential to us? Or is an hour on a Sunday morning enough? In what ways might Jesus be the essence, be the basis of our lives? Each of us, I'm sure, will have our own answer to that. An answer which may well change as the years progress. And since I'm not going to ask any of you to contribute at this point, I can only offer something of where I think I may be now in terms of being able to answer this. And maybe it will resonate with you. To me, at the moment, Jesus is the main pointer to what God is. I see things in the memory of his life, recorded in the Gospels, which speak of care, of compassion, of inclusion, of valuing human wholeness and well-being. I see in his remembered life and death a willingness to confront injustice, to challenge structures of power which worked against people attaining fullness of life. And all of these things I would sum up with one word, and that word is love. I think that the love we see in the stories of Jesus points us to the conclusion that God is love. To me, what Jesus means is that I have been given a glimpse of a quality of love to which I feel I should somehow aspire. I'm not sure if categories like Messiah or Son of God really help that aspiration all that much. They mean things to me, but to folk who are not part of the church, they may not mean much at all. Rather, it seems to me that love, rather than definitions, rather than categories, comes first. And therefore, if we are to say that Jesus is to be the basis, the essence of our lives, I think that means that love, the kind of love we see him living and speaking of, must be the basis and the essence, which makes the difference between a life of mere existence and life in all its fullness. Amen.